The morning mist clung to the glass spires of Halcyon, like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their grip on the city's gleaming towers. Captain Mira Thorne stood at the edge of Memorial Plaza, watching as the first rays of Aurora Prime's binary suns pierced through the fog, casting long shadows across the polished granite monuments. Today marked the centennial anniversary of the final battle, when humanity's expeditionary force had made their last stand against the hegemony's advancing fleets. Mira adjusted her Unity Council uniform, the midnight blue fabric crisp against the cool morning air. As the city's chief Xenotech archivist, she had organized this ceremony countless times, but today felt different. Perhaps it was the weight of a century's worth of carefully curated memories. Or perhaps it was the persistent whisper of doubt that had been growing louder in her mind with each passing year. The official records were pristine, almost too pristine. Every human soldier accounted for every death cataloged with meticulous precision. The sacrifice had been total, the heroism absolute, and the peace that followed had endured for 100 years. Yet, Mira couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing from the narrative, like a melody, with a note deliberately left unplayed. Citizens began to gather in the plaza, their faces solemn with practiced reverence. Representatives from the various Unity Council member species stood in orderly ranks, the towering Vorthak, with their crystalline exoskeletons, the ethereal Zephyrians, whose translucent skin caught the morning light, and dozens of other species that had found peace under the Council's governance. All united in their remembrance of humanity's noble sacrifice. Mira's fingers traced the edge of her data tablet, where she had loaded the ceremonial speeches and archived footage. The same images played every year, heroic humans, charging into impossible odds, their ships exploding in brilliant bursts of light, their final transmissions declaring eternal loyalty to the cause of peace. Beautiful, tragic, and somehow incomplete. The ceremony proceeded with clockwork precision. Council Speaker Vexhai delivered the traditional eulogy in her melodious Zephyrian tones, her words floating across the plaza like silver bells. The crowd bowed their heads in unison, a sea of diverse forms, united in remembrance. Mira found herself studying their faces, wondering if any of them harbored the same doubts that gnawed at her. As the formal proceedings concluded, and the crowd began to disperse, Mira noticed a group of Unity Council excavation workers setting up equipment near the northern edge of the plaza. She approached their supervisor, a stocky Vorthak named Krixtal, whose crystalline features gleamed in the strengthening sunlight. "Sanction dig," Mira inquired, displaying her archival credentials on her tablet. Krixtal's mandibles clicked in acknowledgement. "Foundation repairs for the new memorial wing. Council approved the excavation last month. We're to be careful of any artifacts naturally." Mira nodded, though. Something about the timing struck her as odd. Why begin such work on the centennial itself? She made a mental note to review the excavation permits later, but for now, she had her own duties to attend to. The rest of the day passed in familiar routine. Mira processed requests for historical data, updated archival records, and guided visiting scholars through the vast digital libraries housed within the Council's central complex. But as evening approached, she found herself drawn back to Memorial Plaza, where the excavation crew was packing up their equipment for the day. The dig site had been carefully cordoned off, but Mira's archival access codes granted her entry to most restricted areas. She approached the excavation pit, a neat rectangular cavity, about 3 meters deep, and peered down into the carefully exposed layers of soil and debris. Most of the artifacts appeared to be standard architectural fragments from the original plaza construction, but something metallic caught her eye near the eastern corner of the pit. Mira climbed down into the excavation using the worker's ladder, her boots crunching softly on the loose earth. The object was partially buried beneath a chunk of fallen masonry, and she carefully brushed away the accumulated dirt with her gloved hands. What emerged made her breath catch in her throat. It was a human battle helmet scarred by weapons fire and blackened by what could only have been intense heat. The design was unmistakably from the final battle era, with the distinctive angular lines and composite materials that marked the last generation of human military equipment. But what made Mira's heart race was not the helmet itself, but what she could see etched into the inner surface of the visor. She carefully lifted the helmet from its resting place and angled it toward the fading light. There, carved with painstaking precision into the polymer surface, were words that should not have existed. "Find me, I'm alive." Below, the message was a signature that made Mira's hands tremble. A. Cross-Lint 15th Expeditionary. Lieutenant Aidan Cross. The name was legendary, spoken with the same reverence reserved for mythical heroes. According to every historical record, Cross had died defending the last evacuation shuttle, buying time for civilian refugees to escape Halcyon before the hegemony bombardment began. His sacrifice had been the final act of human resistance on Aurora Prime, and his name graced the largest monument in the plaza above. Yet, here was his helmet bearing a message that contradicted everything the Unity Council had taught for a century. Mira looked around the empty excavation site, her mind racing. If this discovery became public, it would shatter the carefully maintained narrative that had kept peace among the Council species. But if it was authentic, if Aidan Cross had somehow survived the final battle, then 100 years of official history was built on a lie. The sound of approaching footsteps made Mira quickly conceal the helmet beneath her jacket. She climbed out of the pit just as a Unity Council security patrol rounded the corner, their energy weapons glowing softly in the twilight. Citizen Thorne, the lead officer, a tall hegemony descendant with the species' characteristic ridge-lined skull, nodded respectfully. "Working late?" "Just conducting a final survey of the excavation site," Mira replied, keeping her voice steady. "Ensuring proper archival protocols are being followed." The officer seemed satisfied with her explanation and continued on his patrol. Mira waited until they were out of sight before making her way back to her apartment in the residential district, the hidden helmet weighing heavily against her side. Her living quarters were modest, but comfortable, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of the city's central spire. Mira activated her apartment's privacy shields and carefully placed the helmet on her desk, studying it under the bright illumination of her work lamps. The craftsmanship of the etched message was remarkable, the letters carved with a precision that spoke of desperate determination rather than hasty graffiti. She ran her fingers over the helmet's surface, noting the pattern of damage. The scoring was consistent with plasma weapons, the kind used by both human and hegemony forces during the war. But there were also signs of careful preservation, as if someone had deliberately protected this artifact for future discovery. Mira activated her personal computer and began cross-referencing the helmet's design specifications with her archival databases. The search confirmed what she already suspected: this was genuine military equipment from the final battle period. More specifically, it matched the exact specifications for helmets issued to the 15th Expeditionary Regiment, Aidan Cross's unit. But accessing Cross's complete service record would require penetrating the Council's classified archives, a violation of her archival oath that could result in exile, or worse. Mira stared at the helmet, weighing her options. She could report the discovery through proper channels, watch it disappear into the Council's bureaucratic machinery, and pretend she had never seen that impossible message. Or she could risk everything to uncover the truth. The memory of the ceremony that morning decided her. All those faces, human and alien alike, united in mourning for a sacrifice that might never have happened. They deserved to know the truth, whatever the consequences. Mira spent the next several hours crafting a false report about the excavation, claiming that the helmet had been damaged beyond recovery when a support beam collapsed during the dig. She filed the report through official channels, ensuring that any future inquiries would show the artifact as lost. Then, she began the delicate process of accessing the Council's restricted databases. Her archival credentials granted her access to most historical records, but the deepest levels of the database required additional authentication. Mira had spent years building relationships with fellow archivists and data technicians, and she called in several favors to obtain temporary access codes for the Lost Records Vault, a digital repository where the Council stored information deemed too sensitive for general access. The Vault's security systems were formidable, requiring not only proper credentials, but also biometric verification and real-time behavioral analysis. Mira crafted a plausible research request, claiming to investigate discrepancies in casualty reports for a historical analysis paper. The request was approved after a tense 12-hour review period. Accessing the vault required a physical visit to the Council's Central Archive facility, a massive underground complex beneath Halcyon's government district. Mira arrived early in the morning before the regular staff shift began, and made her way through the labyrinthine corridors to the vault access chamber. The chamber itself was a marvel of xenotech engineering with crystalline data matrices lining the walls and holographic interfaces floating in mid-air like captured starlight. Mira activated her access codes and began searching for records related to the 15th Expeditionary Regiment. What she found made her blood run cold. The official casualty reports listed every member of the 15th as killed in action, but buried deep in the classified communications logs was a series of transmissions that painted a very different picture. In the final hours of the battle, several human units had reported successful withdrawals to hidden shelters, awaiting extraction that never came. The most damning evidence was a coded transmission from Aiden Cross himself, sent 3 days after his supposed death. The message was fragmentary, corrupted by interference, but Mira could make out coordinates and a desperate plea for rescue. The transmission had been received by Council forces logged and then buried so deep that only someone with her level of access could ever have found it. But as Mira delved deeper into the records, she became aware of a soft humming sound that hadn't been there before. She looked up from her console to see a Council surveillance drone hovering near the chamber entrance. Its sensor array focused directly on her position. The machine's presence meant that her activities had been flagged by the security system. Mira quickly downloaded the relevant files to a portable storage device and began the process of covering her digital tracks. But as she worked, the drone moved closer, its scanning beams washing over her in waves of pale blue light. She had perhaps minutes before security personnel arrived to investigate. The coordinates from Cross's transmission were burned into her memory, a location in the cavern systems beneath Aurora Prime's ice moon, a barren satellite that had been abandoned since the war's end. If Cross had somehow survived, if other humans had escaped to that desolate refuge, then the proof of the Council's deception might still be waiting to be found. Mira completed her data purge and made her way toward the chamber exit, but the surveillance drone moved to block her path. Its mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. Unauthorized data access detected. Please remain stationary for security verification. Instead of complying, Mira activated an emergency fire suppression system, filling the chamber with thick foam that temporarily blinded the drone sensors. She ran through the corridors of the archive facility, her heart pounding as alarms began to sound throughout the complex. Behind her, she could hear the heavy footsteps of security guards rushing to investigate the disturbance. Mira reached the surface level and blended into the crowd of early morning commuters, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. The Unity Council had not only abandoned human survivors, but had actively suppressed evidence of their existence. The peace that Aurora Prime had enjoyed for a century was built on a foundation of lies and betrayal. But uncovering the truth would require more than archival research. She needed to reach the ice moon to find whatever remained of the human survivors and to bring back proof that could not be denied or buried. And for that, she would need help from someone willing to risk everything for the chance of vindication. Arlo Vance operated his data smuggling business from a converted maintenance bay in Halcyon's industrial district, a maze of pipes and power conduits that had been abandoned when the city expanded upward into its gleaming towers. Mira found him hunched over a jury-rigged computer console, his cybernetic implants glowing softly as he interfaced directly with the machine's data streams. "Captain Thorne," Arlo said without looking up from his work. "Bit early for a social call, isn't it?" Mira had known Arlo for 3 years, ever since he had helped her recover corrupted historical files from a damaged archive server. He was a former Unity Council drone pilot who had been discharged after questioning orders during a border patrol mission. Since then, he had made his living moving information for clients who preferred to avoid official channels. "I need transport to the Ice Moon," Mira said without preamble. "And I need someone who won't ask questions about why." Arlo finally looked up his augmented eye, focusing on her with mechanical precision. "The Ice Moon. That's a restricted zone, Mira. Council patrol ships sweep those coordinates twice a week." "I can pay," Mira replied, placing a credit chip on his workbench. "Enough to cover fuel risk premium and a significant bonus for discretion." Arlo picked up the chip and examined its authentication code. "This is a lot of money for a simple transport job. What aren't you telling me?" Mira hesitated, then pulled the battle helmet from her bag and placed it on the workbench. Arlo's cybernetic eye whirred as it analyzed the artifact, and his organic eye widened with recognition. "That's human military gear," he whispered. "Final battle era." "Read the inscription," Mira said quietly. Arlo lifted the helmet and peered at the etched message. His face went pale as he read the words, and his hands began to shake slightly. "This is impossible. Aiden Cross died a century ago." "The official records say he died," Mira corrected. "But this helmet tells a different story, and I think there are more survivors waiting on the Ice Moon." Arlo set the helmet down carefully, as if it might explode at any moment. "Do you have any idea what you're suggesting? If the Council has been lying about the final battle, if there really are human survivors, then the peace we've enjoyed for 100 years is built on betrayal and murder," Mira finished. "And those survivors have been waiting for rescue that never came." Arlo was quiet for a long moment, his augmented systems processing the implications. Finally, he nodded. "My ship's not much to look at, but she's fast, and her stealth systems are military grade. When do we leave?" "Now," Mira replied. "I accessed the Council's classified archives last night. It won't be long before they realize what I've found." Arlo's ship, the Wanderer, was indeed unremarkable. From the outside, a battered cargo hauler that looked like it had seen better decades. But Mira could see the subtle modifications that marked it as something special. Upgraded engine housings, military-grade sensor arrays, and the telltale shimmer of adaptive camouflage plating. They launched from a private landing pad on the city's outskirts, filing a flight plan that listed their destination as a routine cargo run to the outer system. Arlo's pilot credentials were still valid, a legacy of his council service, and they cleared orbital traffic control without incident. The Ice Moon grew larger in their view screen as they approached a world of stark beauty and deadly cold. Its surface was a maze of crystalline formations and deep crevasses sculpted by millions of years of tidal forces and cosmic radiation. Aurora Prime's binary suns cast long shadows across the frozen landscape, creating patterns of light and darkness that shifted constantly as the moon rotated. "According to the coordinates you found, we're looking for something in the Meridian crevasse system," Arlo said, studying his navigation display. "That's deep country, Mira. If we get caught in a cave-in down there..." "We'll be careful," Mira replied, though she knew the risks as well as he did. The Ice Moon's geological activity was unpredictable, and the cavern systems were prone to sudden collapses. They landed on a relatively stable ice shelf near the coordinates from Cross's transmission, and Mira felt the bitter cold seep through her environmental suit as they disembarked. The moon's thin atmosphere provided little protection from the vacuum of space, and their breath formed crystalline clouds that dissipated quickly in the low pressure. The entrance to the crevasse system was a narrow fissure in the ice, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Arlo activated a portable scanner and shook his head at the readings. "The ice goes down at least 50 meters," he reported. And there are definitely artificial structures down there. Metal composite materials, the works. They rappelled into the crevasse, using climbing gear from Arlo's ship, their helmet lights cutting through the blue-white darkness of the ice walls. The descent seemed to take forever, but finally, their feet touched solid ground at the bottom of the fissure. The cavern they found themselves in was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow above their heads. But what captured their attention were the clear signs of human habitation: discarded equipment containers, faded graffiti on the walls, and the unmistakable outline of prefabricated shelters tucked into alcoves in the ice. "Look at this," Arlo called, shining his light on a section of wall covered in carved messages. "These are dated months after the final battle. Someone was definitely alive down here." Mira studied the graffiti, recognizing several names from the 15th Expeditionary's roster. But it was the most recent message that made her heart race. Bunker Alpha 7 Aiden Crossday, 127. Still waiting for pickup. There's more than one shelter, Mira realized, following the beam of her light deeper into the cavern. This was a whole survivor colony. They made their way through the abandoned camp, finding evidence of desperate improvisation and gradual despair. Food containers marked with dates spanning several years, jury-rigged life support systems, and personal belongings left behind by people who had finally given up hope of rescue. But at the far end of the cavern, they found something that made Mira's breath catch in her throat: a sealed airlock door marked with the words Bunker Alpha 7 and the insignia of the 15th Expeditionary Regiment. "The coordinates cross-transmitted," Mira whispered. "This is it." Arlo examined the airlock's control panel, shaking his head at the alien technology. "This lock is biometric. DNA scanner, voice print recognition, the works. Without the right authorization." Mira pulled out Cross's helmet and placed it against the scanner. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ancient mechanism hummed to life, recognizing patterns encoded in the helmet's material composition. The airlock cycled open with a soft hiss of equalizing pressure. Beyond the door was a corridor lined with functional lighting that activated as they approached. The bunker was larger than the abandoned camp, carved directly into the ice moon's bedrock and reinforced with composite materials. Emergency power systems had kept the life support running for a century, waiting for someone to find the hidden refuge. They followed the corridor deeper into the bunker, passing empty chambers that had once housed dozens of survivors. But it was the central chamber that took their breath away. In the middle of the room stood a single cryostasis pod, its status lights glowing steady green. Beside it, a holographic projector waited in standby mode. Mira approached the pod with trembling hands and peered through its transparent aluminum window. Inside, preserved in perfect suspended animation, was a man in a Unity Council uniform from the final battle era. His face was peaceful, unmarked by time, and the nameplate on his chest read, "Cross A Lieutenant." "He's actually alive," Arlo breathed, staring at the pod's readouts. "After all this time, he's really alive." Mira activated the holographic projector, and the chamber filled with the ghostly image of Aiden Cross, recording his final message. The hologram's uniform was torn and battle-scarred, and his face showed the strain of impossible decisions. "If you're seeing this," the recording began, "then you found my message and made it to the bunker. I pray that means the war is over, and that someone finally came looking for survivors." Cross's holographic form gestured toward the cryopod. "I volunteered for stasis when our supplies began running low. The others, they held out as long as they could, but the cold and the isolation finally took them. I'm the last one left." The recording paused, and Cross seemed to struggle with his next words. "There's something you need to know about the final battle, about why we never made it off Aurora Prime. The Unity Council. They made a deal with the hegemony. Peace in exchange for abandoning the human expeditionary force. We were sacrificed to buy time for the other species to negotiate." Mira felt sick as the implications sank in. The heroic last stand that had been celebrated for a century was actually a betrayal, a cold-blooded trade of human lives for political advantage. I sabotaged our own evacuation shuttle, Cross continued, his voice heavy with regret. There was classified intel on board strategic plans that would have given the hegemony a significant advantage if they had captured them. I destroyed the shuttle and scattered my regiment to hidden shelters, hoping that someday the truth would come out. The hologram flickered as the recording neared its end. I've programmed the stasis pod to respond to my helmet's biometric signature. If you've made it this far, if you've found the evidence I left behind, then you're probably the kind of person who won't let this secret stay buried. Wake me up and I'll help you expose the truth. The recording faded, leaving Mira and Arlo alone with the sleeping form of a legend. But before either of them could approach the cryopod, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the corridor behind them. Unity Council security forces had found the bunker. Inspector Kale Zorin stepped into the chamber, flanked by 6 armed guards in full combat armor. His pale hegemony features were set in an expression of cold determination, and his eyes fixed on the helmet in Mira's hands with unmistakable recognition. "Nah, Captain Thorne," Zorin said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You've led us on quite a chase, but this ends now." "You knew," Mira accused, backing toward the cryopod. "You knew there were survivors and you've been covering it up for a century." Zorin's expression didn't change. "I know that the peace we've enjoyed requires certain accommodations with the truth. The sacrifice of a few for the benefit of many. The sacrifice of a few." Arlo stepped forward, his hand moving toward the energy weapon at his side. "We're talking about genocide, Zorin. The systematic abandonment of an entire species. The humans chose their fate when they refused to negotiate," Zorin replied coldly. "The Council offered them terms, and they responded with military aggression. The consequences were regrettable but necessary." Mira felt rage building in her chest as she realized the depth of the Council's deception. "You're lying. The humans were trying to protect everyone from the hegemony's expansion. They died thinking they were heroes." "They were useful," Zorin said with chilling indifference. "Their deaths provided the emotional foundation for lasting peace. A beautiful story of noble sacrifice that has kept the member species united for 100 years. The cryopod's warning alarm suddenly activated its status lights, shifting from green to amber. Mira looked at the readouts and realized that the pod's power supply was failing its century-old systems, finally reaching the end of their operational life. "If you want Cross to survive, you'll step away from the pod and surrender," Zorin threatened. "Otherwise, we'll simply wait for the stasis field to collapse and bury this embarrassing chapter of history, along with its last witness." Mira looked at the helmet in her hands, then at the sleeping form of Aiden Cross. Everything she had been taught about the final battle, about the heroic sacrifice that had secured peace for Aurora Prime, was a lie. But the truth was within her grasp, waiting to be awakened from a century of enforced slumber. She made her choice. Mira placed Cross's helmet against the cryopod's emergency revival system, and the ancient mechanism responded with a cascade of warning lights and status alerts. The stasis field began to dissipate, and Cross's vital signs appeared on the monitoring displays as his body began the delicate process of returning to consciousness. "Stop her!" Zorin shouted, and his guards raised their weapons. But Arlo was already moving, pulling a pair of improvised pulse charges from his equipment pack and hurling them toward the chamber entrance. The devices exploded in a shower of sparks and debris, temporarily blinding the Council forces and buying precious seconds for Cross's revival process to complete. The cryopod's lid hissed open, and Aiden Cross drew his first breath in a century. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty on Mira's face as she leaned over him. "You found me," he whispered, his voice hoarse from 100 years of silence. "I knew someone would come." "We need to go," Mira said urgently, helping Cross sit up in the pod. "The Council forces are here and they want to bury the truth along with you." Cross's training kicked in despite his weakened condition, and he assessed their tactical situation with the eye of an experienced soldier. "The maintenance tunnel," he said, pointing toward a concealed panel in the chamber's far wall. "It leads back to the glacier mouth, but we'll need to move fast." Arlo's pulse charges had created enough chaos to scatter the council guards, but Zoran was already rallying his forces for a coordinated assault. "You cannot escape the truth of your situation," the inspector called out through the smoke and debris. "Cross is a relic of a dead cause, and you're traitors to the peace we've built." "The peace you've built is founded on lies," Cross replied, his voice growing stronger as his body adapted to consciousness. "And lies always collapse eventually." They made their way to the maintenance tunnel as energy weapons fire erupted behind them. The passage was narrow and treacherous, carved through solid ice, and barely wide enough for a single person. But Cross knew its layout from the days when he had supervised its construction, and he guided them through the twisting route with confidence, born of desperate familiarity. Behind them, they could hear Zoran's forces, following their footsteps echoing through the tunnel as they gave pursuit. But the inspector had made a tactical error in bringing only a small force, confident that he could handle a simple arrest operation. Against a trained military officer like Cross, even weakened by a century in stasis, the odds were more even than he had anticipated. They reached the glacier mouth just as Aurora Prime's binary suns were setting, casting long shadows across the ice-moon surface. Arlo's ship waited where they had left it, its engines already warming in preparation for departure. "The holographic logs," Cross said as they ran toward the Wanderer. "Did you recover them from the bunker?" Mira patted the portable storage device in her pocket. "Everything. Your testimony, the Council's communications, all of it." "Then we have what we need to expose the truth," Cross replied grimly. "But they'll try to suppress it, just like they've been doing for a century." They reached the ship and scrambled aboard, just as Zoran's forces emerged from the tunnel. Energy weapons fire lit up the ice around them as Arlo initiated the launch sequence, the Wanderer's engines roaring to life, with a sound like controlled thunder. "Where to?" Arlo asked, as they lifted off the council guards, shrinking to tiny figures on the ice below. "Everywhere," Mira replied, connecting her storage device to the ship's communication array. "Every network, every data stream, every public channel in the system." Cross leaned over her shoulder as she began uploading the holographic testimony to the ship's broadcasting system. "The Council will try to jam the transmission." "Let them try," Mira said grimly. "Arlo's installed some interesting modifications to this ship's communication array. Military-grade encryption, multiple redundant channels, and enough power to punch through most jamming attempts." As the Wanderer cleared the ice moon's gravity well and entered the space lanes around Aurora Prime, Mira activated the broadcast. Cross's century-old testimony began streaming across every public network in the system, his words carrying the weight of absolute truth as he described the Council's betrayal and the abandonment of human survivors. The reaction was immediate and explosive. On Aurora Prime's surface, crowds began gathering in public squares, watching the holographic testimony on massive display screens. The careful narrative of heroic sacrifice began to crumble as Cross's words exposed the cold reality of political expedience and calculated betrayal. In Halcyon's government district, emergency sessions were called as council representatives struggled to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond their ability to manage. But the damage was already done. The truth, suppressed for a century, was finally free. "This is Council authority to unidentified vessel," a voice crackled over the ship's communication system. "You are ordered to cease your unauthorized broadcast and submit to arrest." "This is Lieutenant Aidan Cross of the 15th Expeditionary Regiment," Cross replied, taking control of the communication array. "And I am a citizen of Aurora Prime, addressing my fellow citizens about crimes committed in their name." The silence that followed his transmission was profound, as if the entire system was holding its breath. Then, gradually responses began to filter in from across Aurora Prime's surface. Individual Council Guard units were refusing orders to suppress the demonstrations. Civilian networks were amplifying the broadcast, spreading Cross's testimony to every corner of the system. And in Halcyon's Memorial Plaza, where Mira had begun her search for the truth, crowds of humans and aliens alike were gathering around the monuments dedicated to the fallen heroes of the final battle, demanding answers from a government that had built its authority on a foundation of lies. "Look at that," Arlo said, pointing to the tactical display that showed dozens of council ships moving to intercept them. "They're throwing everything they have at us." But as the council fleet closed in, something unprecedented happened. Individual ships began breaking formation, their crews refusing to fire on the vessel carrying Aiden Cross. The carefully maintained unity of the council's forces was fracturing along the same lines as the society they were sworn to protect. "This is Captain Vexhai of the council ship Meridian," a familiar voice announced over the communication channel. It was the same Zephyrian who had delivered the ceremonial eulogy just days earlier. "Lieutenant Cross, it is an honor to finally meet a legend." "The honor is mine, Captain," Cross replied. "Thank you for your courage." "The courage was yours a century ago," Vexhai responded. "We have much to atone for." As they descended toward Aurora Prime's surface, Mira watched the crowds growing larger in every major city. The truth that had been buried for 100 years was finally seeing the light of day, and no amount of council authority could put it back in the darkness. They landed at Halcyon's main spaceport to find thousands of people waiting, their faces a mixture of anger, shame, and hope. Unity Council representatives were nowhere to be seen, having retreated to their government complexes to await the inevitable political reckoning. Cross stepped out of the ship and onto Aurora Prime soil for the first time in a century, and the crowd fell silent. Here was a living reminder of the price that had been paid for their peace, a man who had sacrificed everything and then been abandoned by the very people he had tried to protect. 100 years ago. Cross said, his voice carrying clearly across the spaceport. "My regiment made a choice to trust in the Unity Council's promise of evacuation. We were betrayed, abandoned, and left to die in the cold. But we were not defeated, because the truth cannot be killed." The crowd erupted in a roar of approval, but Cross raised his hand for silence. "I do not seek vengeance," he continued. "I seek justice, not just for the humans who died waiting for rescue that never came, but for all the citizens of Aurora Prime who were denied the right to know their own history." Over the following weeks, the political structure of Aurora Prime underwent a transformation that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The Unity Council was dissolved, its leadership either fleeing the system or facing trial for their role in the century-long cover-up. In their place rose a provisional assembly with representatives from all species, including a human delegation, led by Aiden Cross himself. Inspector Zoran disappeared during the chaos of the government's collapse, but his fate was ultimately irrelevant. The system of lies and suppression he had represented was crumbling, replaced by institutions committed to transparency and truth. Mira found herself appointed as the head of a new organization, the Archive of Shared Histories, dedicated to uncovering and preserving the complete story of Aurora Prime's past. Her first act was to declassify all historical records, ensuring that no truth could ever again be buried for political convenience. Cross adapted to his new life with remarkable resilience, though he was forever changed by his century of isolation. He worked tirelessly to rebuild trust between the species, using his unique perspective as both victim and survivor to bridge the gap between past betrayal and future reconciliation. "Do you think we can really build something better?" Mira asked him one evening as they walked through Memorial Plaza, now renamed Remembrance Square, in honor of all who had died, both those who had been remembered and those who had been forgotten. Cross looked up at the stars, visible now through the transparent dome that had replaced the opaque memorial structures. "We have to try," he replied. "That's what they died for, not for glory or politics, but for the hope that their sacrifice would mean something." The binary suns of Aurora Prime set behind them, casting long shadows across the square. But for the first time in a century, those shadows were not hiding secrets. The truth, painful as it was, had finally been brought into the light. In the months that followed, expeditions were launched to search for other human survivors throughout the system. Rumors persisted of hidden colonies on distant worlds of refugee groups that had escaped the betrayal and built new lives in exile. Whether these stories were true remained to be seen, but the very fact that such searches were now possible represented a fundamental shift in Aurora Prime's approach to its own history. Cross often stood at the observation deck of the new archive building, watching ships depart on these missions of discovery and reconciliation. Each vessel carried the hope that somewhere in the vast darkness of space, other survivors might be waiting for the rescue that had been so long delayed. The helmet that had started it all sat in a place of honor in the archive's central gallery, its simple message serving as a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface. Visitors from across the system came to see it, to read those 4 words that had changed everything. Find me. I'm alive. And in the end, that was exactly what had happened. Aiden Cross had been found, the truth had been brought to light, and Aurora Prime had begun the long process of healing from a century of lies. The peace that emerged from that healing was more fragile than what had come before, built on honest reckoning rather than comfortable deception. But it was also more genuine, founded on the bedrock of shared truth rather than the shifting sands of political expediency. The story of the final battle would be told differently now, with all its complexity and moral ambiguity exposed for future generations to study and understand. Heroes and villains were revealed to be neither purely good nor entirely evil, but complex individuals making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. And in that complexity, in that honest acknowledgement of past failures and future possibilities, Aurora Prime found something it had never truly possessed before: genuine unity, built not on the suppression of inconvenient truths, but on the courage to face them together, whatever the cost.